The children who need the most love are asking for it in often the most unloving ways, and the behavior that is trying to push us away.
What does loving your neighbor actually look like? This is Journey with Care, where curious Canadians get inspired to love others well through real-life stories and honest conversations. Welcome to Journey with Care. I'm Johan. Today we don't have Wendy with us. She is actually in Scotland dropping her daughter off for school. So it's just me again. Wendy's intro got cut off last week. If you haven't noticed, we didn't mention it, but her internet got cut off. So it's just me again. We are in our series, The Battery Life of a Caregiver, and we're exploring the lives of those who dedicate themselves to caregiving roles. We'll uncover what it takes, their self-care strategies, and how our communities can provide much-needed support around them. So today we are joined by Amy Jo, who was a previous guest on the season, episode 11, Leading Differently Together. She did the teachers episode, really good. I'll throw that in the show notes, and you should go listen to that if you haven't heard it. Amy Jo, who has extensive experience in caregiving of some of our most vulnerable as an early childhood educator. I'll let her talk a little bit more about what she does. But before we get to that, remember that we have Journey with Prayer, 5-minute devotional series to start off your week. That's on a separate podcast feed. Also to remind you, we exist and continue to produce great content and interviews because of the generosity of our listeners, donors, and sponsors to help produce the podcast and the work of Care Impact in the community. We value your support, and we would love to connect with new sponsors and people that just want to donate to the podcast as well to help keep this going. You can go to careimpact.ca/podcast if you want to get involved. All right, Amy Jo, you're part of the Care Impact team, part of our trauma care training team. You're based in Ottawa with nearly 2 decades of diverse experience in various roles. From what I know about you, you're passionate about creating inclusive and supportive environments. Did I miss anything there? Would you like to tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now, what you're giving your time and energies to?
Well, thank you, Johan. It is a privilege to be here again. And you're right. I've worked in a lot of diverse experiences and alongside children and families. And I'm very grateful for the ways they have shaped me in the work that I do now. So I'm currently working as a resource consultant, supporting children with special needs and really coming alongside educators, building capacity for them to support the children in their care.
So you've worn many hats. I know you've done mission work as well. You want to talk about some other areas where you've done some of those caregiving roles?
Yeah, so when I look back at my journey, I have always, I think, had a leaning towards helping caregiving helper roles. And when I look at, I think I talked in the last time when we were talking about teaching and just the ways that we're shaped throughout our lives and the ways that we are built into who we are by the people who impact us. And even as I look at my own history of my grandma, who was a teacher and impacted children, and my dad, who was a teacher, I can see that a lot of the shaping of my life was natural giftings, I think, that were a leaning that I had towards teaching and caregiving, and then all of the experiences along the way. So I began with an interest in working with children. I didn't know exactly how. And then as I stepped into different spaces and studying early childhood education, becoming a nanny for a family who had a little guy who ended up being diagnosed with autism, as I stepped into different preschool classrooms and school classrooms, I just noticed along the way there was a trend that I was drawn to the children with special needs. And I really feel like they have been the reason I'm doing what I'm doing today. Almost like this role that I'm in now, the different roles I'm in trauma care training and resourcing has chosen me instead of me specifically choosing these roles.
Can you elaborate on what continues to draw you to working with children and vulnerable children?
Well, you mentioned, Johan, that I had also done some international work, and I was reflecting on what is the heart of the work that I've done with children, both locally and internationally. And there was a common thread as I traveled from different places. I had the privilege of helping with a school in the Dominican that some friends started to run in their garage because they saw the need for children in their neighborhood. I was also in Peru working with some children's homes. One of them was a place where deaf children could come because they weren't able to access sign language in their local schools. And whether it was in the Dominican, in Peru, in a hot little church in Mexico, to here locally, working in classrooms and camps, I saw a common thread that children are longing to be seen and connected with. And they're longing for someone to look at them and delight in them, no matter where they are on the globe.
It's good. So your biography reads that you believe in the power of connected relationships for healing and thriving. Can you share an example from your work experience that illustrates this, or a story?
Well, that word connection has been something that has become so important to me in the work that I do. And even as I was just reflecting on some of the work internationally and the children and families that I got to walk alongside, there were moments when I saw lack of resources. As we know, sometimes those can be a huge barrier to children getting the care and the learning and the growth that they need. But I also saw so many moments when a caring adult bridged that gap to meet the needs of the child with their presence and with their time and with their energy. I saw like the caregivers at the school in Peru learning sign language, translating for these children so they could connect with them. Locally, I've seen educators and teachers working alongside children who we would say in the language of trauma. Karen Purvis, who is someone that we have learned a lot from in our trauma care training, she talks about the children who need the most love are asking for it in often the most unloving ways and the behavior that is trying to push us away. And even just recently, I saw an educator team welcome a little girl into their room who was, with all of her behavior, asking to be sent away. But they told her over and over again through their presence and through their connection and through making sure they were always available for a hug or to hold a hand when she was throwing things in the room because she was having a big meltdown. Instead of responding and reacting to the behavior, rather, they responded with care. And I saw that little girl thrive in that environment.
Love that quote that you shared there. Those that need the most love are often asking for it in the most unloving ways. And it's true, I find that those caregivers that care the most often give the most of themselves in order to care for the one that they're caring for. Like learning sign language, and maybe when the person you're caring for isn't even your responsibility, continuing to open up your home and your heart, making yourself available to be there for them. Like, what would we do without those caregivers that go above and beyond? Now, our series, Battery Life of a Caregiver, so we're going to talk about that a little bit, but I'm kind of working our way to that. You mentioned Karen Purvis and TBRI. So how has that training informed your approach to care?
So yeah, TBRI, for those who may not have heard of it before, it's Trust-Based Relational Intervention. So it's a intervention that came from Karen Purvis' research as she spent time with children who were from hard places and who had experienced a lot of trauma. And she saw these moments of connection and these moments of care really bringing healing to these children. So as I spent some time learning alongside Karen Purvis, her team of teachers and educators, and as I've grown alongside the Care Impact team, as we learn and we train in trauma care training, I've learned even more about looking at the behavior of children, looking at the need behind their behavior. And as I go out in the work that I do, I look for those moments when there's something deeper. You know, we talk about the iceberg and where so much of what we see on the surface is not really what's underneath. And there's so much hidden often. And I've also reflected that in the work that I've done over the years, I wasn't aware of the toll that it was taking on me as I met the needs of those children. And as I absorbed a lot of what was going on underneath that iceberg.
So taking the training to care for others, you've recognized some things in your own life that you took from that training on how to care for yourself. Can you share some examples from TBRI or Trauma-Free World training that has helped you learn how to care for yourself a little bit better as a caregiver?
Well, it's interesting when I look back and I realize how much I didn't understand about the nervous system And anyone who's listening who is in the field of caregiving in some capacity, whether it's teaching, early childhood education, social work, a parent, we're connected to a lot of foster adoptive parents in the work that we do with Care Impact. We understand that when you are regulating and co-regulating, which is a term that we use for that co-regulating that needs to happen for children when they are developing their ability to regulate on their own. And we understand the toll that that takes on our own nervous system, but I didn't understand that years ago looking back. And so I held a lot of that stress and a lot of the emotional weight of the children and the things that they were going through in my body without knowing that that's what I was doing.
So working in caregiving roles can be incredibly rewarding. We know that, but also demanding. Can you tell us about your support system? Because in the nature of the work that you're doing, you're just always pouring out into people. I mean, I'm sure there's some rewards in the work itself, but what about your support system and how it helps you stay motivated and energized in the work that you do?
I love this question, Johan, because I think it's so important to realize that for all of us as caregivers, we need to know that we're not alone in the work that we do. And when we look at resilience and the study of resilience, one of the biggest factors, both for children and for us as adults, is a support system. And what that looks like in making sure that we can, as you said, as we pour out, that we're being filled back up again and our buckets are being refilled and refueled. And I was thinking back through some of the ways that my community has supported me. And I think one thing that is so, so key is for us to be seen. And I know recently you were talking to a social worker who was saying, just that importance of people coming alongside and seeing the work that you do and how difficult it is. And as I've had friends and family who, when they ask, how are you and how is your day? There were times when I would come home from a busy day of teaching kindergarten and someone would ask, how was your day? And I just didn't know what to say. Because which part of the day? The part where, there was delight and joy on the face of this little child that just brought me joy? Or the part where this little guy, because of his dysfunction at home and because of his trauma, sobbed into my lap and yelled at me and said that I didn't care about him as we tried to, keep him on track during the day. So that the rest of the class would be held together. And I look at those moments of others really being willing to listen and willing to see me in the work that I did, not just as the fun part of it, but really listen to some of those harder stories.
You mentioned Rebecca, the social worker that we had on for one of our previous interviews, and how she mentioned how those recognizing the work that you do and how important it is. How huge is it for the caregivers to keep them going, to keep that battery life running, for those being cared for to recognize the care that they're being given, and to those that are watching you care for the vulnerable, for them to recognize your work? Like, how much does that help your battery life and keep you going when you come home? Like, are those things that you replay in your head over and over?
Well, I will say I have a jar on my dresser of special rocks and things that I've collected. And I have a shell in there a seashell that in one of my principals, it was a very challenging class that I was dealing with. And I remember going into the office one day to my mailbox. And this is how much those little gestures mean, because she had put a seashell in each of our mailboxes with a little note of how much she saw the work that we were doing with these individual children who were like precious seashells gathered on the beach. And that this was a reminder to keep going and keep doing the work that we are doing. And that had no monetary value. And she probably doesn't even remember giving it to me, but I took that and I saved it. And just like the little things that children say, we can be attuned to those moments as caregivers. They don't have to be big gestures, grand gestures. For me, often it was just a little drawing that the kids would do, a little piece of art. Miss Amy Jo, this is you. And there I am with my glasses and ponytails. And I think, oh, that's how they see me. And they see that I have a smile on my face. And I know that I'm making a difference in their lives. So it doesn't have to be a big grand gesture, but it really does make a difference to be seen in little ways in the work that we do.
A smile can go a long way.
And I will say, I also had a little girl walk in on Superhero Day, and her dad had made a T-shirt with our faces on it, and from a picture that we had given just as a little gift. And he had blown it up, and we were so shocked to see our faces walk into the classroom on this day. And it said, "My teachers are my superheroes." And that was another moment that just, I mean, her little pigtails hanging off. And that moment just gave us so much encouragement that the work that we're doing is seen by this father.
That's amazing. Can you pinpoint a specific time where you felt cared for by someone in your community?
Well, beyond the listening, there's practical help. And I can very much remember one time when a friend, she said, "I'm going to make Play-Doh for your class." And it may have seemed like a very small thing, but I was so overwhelmed looking back. I had children in the school I was teaching in downtown, and there were children from refugee families and children from really challenging situations. I wasn't aware at the time of how much I was carrying, but just something so practical of a resource that I wasn't going to be staying up late that night making Play-Doh for the class. So a little practical things that my mom is so good at finding resources and things that she knew that I was resourcing my classroom. A lot of teachers and educators spend their own money and their own time on bringing resources. And so that was just a way that she showed love to me as well.
That's beautiful. So a little bit of Play-Doh can go a long way. You mentioned the importance of community support for caregivers. Can you offer some suggestions for, like, I know you're involved in the church as well, and you have a church community around you. What about those that are in your church community? How can they offer more support?
Well, I remember, Johan, I was at a church in California when I was doing some work with a disability organization there. And when I talk about being seen, there was a moment that I felt so seen, and it was actually Mother's Day. And Mother's Day can be challenging for some people as we want to honor and recognize mothers. But this particular Sunday, they went up and prayed. And in the prayer, she said, "For those who love and lead and nurture and care." And those words, by the tears rolling down my face, saw me in the work that I was doing. And so I think that there's ways that in our communities, in our churches, we can see those who are serving in maybe ways that are not visible often, but we can see them in those moments and let them know we're supporting them and we're caring for them and appreciating what they do.
It's so good, recognizing people not only for the job that they do, but for the role that they play and those gaps that they fill in people's lives. Let's talk a little bit about self-care. So you mentioned one of those days where you're yelled at by a kid and you're feeling down. So you go through your long day at work and you come home through your door. Burnout is a real risk in the helping profession. So what do you do to unwind when you walk through your door at home? What's that feeling after one of those days? And what do you do to help adjust and recenter yourself?
That's such a good question, Johan. And I feel like this is something that we have to keep coming back to. I was actually talking to Alicia, who you will also hear on the podcast. And she and I were talking about how even as we teach these things, there's times where we feel like we're not practicing them very well in our own lives. And we were talking about how I think the real heart of the matter is paying attention and recalibrating when we can see that maybe we aren't giving ourselves the refuel in the way that we need. So for me, some of those refueling things are to make sure that I'm moving my body. Yesterday I got home and I did not feel like getting on my bike. But instead of driving to the grocery store, I got on my bike and I biked into the sunset and watched the sky turn color, bike to the grocery store. And just moving your body is so key in releasing some of that stress and some of the built up stress of our nervous systems that when we hold the tension and we hold the care of others. And even just moving our body helps our brain to integrate the limbic system and our left and right brain to talk to each other. And so there's science behind that, but you don't have to know the science to know that it is just so important to move your body. And for me, another thing is seeing beauty. And I know that a lot of people who work in the area of trauma have talked about just the ways that our brain can take in so much of the challenge that we're dealing with and the pain of other people's stories. And we need to recalibrate ourselves to beautiful things. And so for me, that is getting up in the morning and going for a walk or a run in the garden near my house. This morning, it was the sunflowers that were stretching up to the sky, reading poetry, making sure I'm a writer. So I process a lot through writing and journaling, and some of that I don't even know what's inside that needs to come out until I really make sure I carve out the time to sit down and write.
I think some of the battle for some people might be that they don't necessarily recognize when they need to recalibrate or when things are becoming overwhelming. So how have you learned to recognize that in your own life? What are some of the red flags you might see when you realize, well, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm having not a good day. I need to be recentered.
Yeah, I think that is very key. And again, looking back, I think there were times when I really got to the boiling point. And, we talk about compassion fatigue and burnout and those things that can just build up until we get to the point where we just don't have tools left and resources left. So I've tried to pay attention now, like on the dashboard, when you're looking for the signs that your tank is getting low. And so for me, some of that is just when I think we've talked a bit about processing emotion, like how do we process some of these sad things that we are experiencing? And I see those signs of overwhelm and just that inability to really work through my own emotions, then I know I need to make time and space for like journaling and writing and just letting out some of what is building up inside.
Is part of that building some of those things like journaling into your routine so you don't have to wait for those challenging days to come? Like, is that something that you learned that you need to do to build into your daily routine to stay regulated?
That is absolutely, absolutely true. And I think one thing that's really helpful for me when you ask about how do we recalibrate is having other people in my life and in my community who know me well and help me to see some of those signs. Just recently when I wasn't well and I was trying to do some things that I felt like needed to be done for work, and a friend said, but does it really need to be done? And just having those people in your life who can help get you back on track when they see that you're overwhelming yourself or you're needing to build those spaces in for more care.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about that balance then, because it's not like you go to work and it's always difficult because you do love caring for the children. Like that's why you do it, because you're passionate about it. It's something on your heart. It's not something you come home saying, oh, I have to do it again tomorrow. But striking a balance between self-care and fully engaging with children can be challenging. Do you have any creative ways as you incorporate self-care activities while working with children? Because there's children outside of your workplace too, right? That you want to engage with.
Yeah, I love that question because it comes to mind just this morning. I was walking with some children down a forest trail and they were having so much fun collecting acorns and tucking them in their pockets and finding them and giving them to me. And I think there are times when the outdoors is so powerful. And when we're spending time with children, we can also combine that with another experience of movement or beauty. This summer, I had the privilege of walking on the beach with my niece and nephew, and just the experience for them of the sensory experience of the waves and the water and the rocks and the sand. And I think that for me, nature is a really powerful way to help regulate both myself and the children that I'm with.
That's great. Side note, I also got to spend time with your niece and nephew walking on the beach this summer, so that's kind of fun. Your brother Tim took us on a fun excursion there in Nova Scotia. Anyway, moving along. On this podcast specifically, you're getting called upon because of your professional roles and your gifts working with children as a teacher. But how do you maintain your own personal identity outside your profession and the things that you're good at as a caregiver and educator?
Well, I appreciate that question. And something that I've been reflecting on recently is the need for me to make sure that I have fun in my life. because that is something also that is very off. It's a buffer to some of these hard things and the challenges that we deal with as caregivers. And I've reflected on how for children, play is so just a part of who they are, and they just go into that flow so easily. And because part of my professional role has been to learn about play, I've reflected on how I need more of that in my life. And so this weekend, a friend just messaged and said, I've booked a campsite. And I said, yes, I want to come. And so some of those things that I'm just making sure that I'm looking at my weekends and making sure that they're not all booked with training and caregiving, but there are also other things in my life that are filling my bucket. And I will say that a gift in my life has been friends who both appreciate me as a caregiver for their children at times, but appreciate me as a friend. And I know that to them, I am a friend and not just a caregiver for their children, even though I love their children dearly.
Let's talk about secondary trauma a little bit. It can be a real concern for caregivers. First of all, what is secondary trauma? And second of all, how do you ensure you're maintaining healthy boundaries to avoid this secondary trauma?
Well, when we work alongside people who are going through different challenges, we often start to experience the pain of their challenges. For example, some of the children that I've worked with, either they've come from countries that have had a lot of unrest and they come as refugees, or there's a home situation that's very dysfunctional. I've worked with children who are palliative or have lost a parent. And some of these situations are very traumatic. And it's easy for us to experience that traumatic situation through caring for this child and their family. And one thing that we talk about in the trauma course is the importance of debriefing, the importance of talking through a situation, whether it's a child or an adult. We call it name it to tame it. I think Dan Siegel coined that phrase, where we name it to tame it, and talking through it takes away some of the overwhelm of that trauma. And so when you work with a good team, I think a lot of people who have worked in a hard, difficult, challenging job will say, you can do a hard thing if you have a good team. And for us in the work that we do, that means having people that are supportive, that you can debrief with on a Friday afternoon if you just email and say, I need to talk through something that happened. So having a supportive team, and again, all these things that we talked about, making sure that we're buffering the rest of our lives with the things that do reorient us to goodness and to beauty and to life, and moving our bodies and eating well and getting sleep and all of those things that will help keep us able to lean towards goodness in the world.
Now, I know you're a person of faith. How does your faith help keep you centered in your daily routines? What role does faith play in your self-care?
Well, I think one thing that I've learned the real value of is solitude and quiet, and in a world that can be very loud, and a job that can be very loud when you're with people and people that have a lot of needs. Just that need to be quiet. And for me, sometimes that means walking outside in the beauty of nature and God's creation. It means often in the morning, just taking that time to breathe and to read and journal, to listen to music on my way to work. I love one of the albums from the Sanctuary course, Sanctuary Songs, that has some beautiful songs to center and ground, and just sometimes a breath prayer of breathing God's peace over the day if there's not time for much else, but just knowing that I don't go into that work alone.
Now, you probably don't work with too many believers in your current workplace, but like doing trauma care work with Care Impact, how important is it for you to have people of faith around you to debrief and have those conversations with?
Well, it has been a gift having the Care Impact team. We're connected across from Winnipeg to Nova Scotia. And just when we get on the screen in those squares for our meetings, we know that each one in that frame understands some of the toll of the work that we do. And there's support, and there is an understanding of the need to be with each other in that space, and to pray for each other, and to walk with each other in the work that we do.
Yeah, and I find it a little bit harder on the screen, but we do have those opportunities where we can connect in person. Those are always really good. I know just having those connecting points, I think with believers that you work with, so important to just debrief some of those frustrations. And talking about frustrations, we haven't really talked about some of those things in the work that you do in caregiving that are frustrating for you, some of those pain points, so that we know what actually brings up that stress. And maybe some people aren't recognizing some of those pain points in their own life.
Well, I think anyone who works in the field of either education or social services somewhere, healthcare, we know that feeling of trying to stop a flood with a beanbag. There's times where it feels like our resources are so small and so stretched and our capacity is so maxed out that I think sometimes it is hard to pinpoint sometimes what exactly is going on inside. And I think for me personally, I tend to go more to overwhelm and to sadness and not even fully understand what might be underneath. Some of that is frustration at some of these challenges that we come across in the systems that are broken and the gaps that we find children are falling through. And so I think it's helpful to acknowledge that some of those things are really challenging and difficult and then come back to some of these practices when we do feel that frustration coming, of making sure that we are filling our own buckets and also coming back to what is our role and what is ours to carry. It's taken me years to really process and learn this, but we know that we are not the ones that can fix everything and solve all the problems. And how do we focus on what God has given us to do and the work that we do, and show up fully for that.
Seems very common in the area of caregiving that there's systematic frustrations. And while we know those continue to exist, you just keep saying yes to it over and over again. So there's obviously some value. There's something rewarding about doing this. There's those things that you can look back on and say it was worth it. Can you think of a time, maybe a situation or something, you can just look back and say, you know what, all the hard work, all those tough times, it was worth it because of that?
Well, there's a lot of those moments. And one of them that really stands out, that little guy I mentioned earlier who was sobbing in my lap often and, yelling at me that I didn't care about him when at the end of the year, we all gathered because I was leaving and I was leaving the school to go on to something else. And all of the children wrote me a book and they said cute things, as kindergarten kids do. But his, I kept close to my heart, and I still have that quote because he wrote, "Miss Amy Jo helps me when I have trouble with stuff." And that just hit my heart because I knew that even through all those moments where he said, "You don't care about me," something got through. And all that care, we made sure there were times where we reorganized our breaks so that we would be with him and so that he wouldn't be alone, and made sure that we always had a place right beside us where he could feel that physical closeness because he had experienced neglect. And when he said, "She helps me when I have trouble with stuff," I knew that love and that care had gotten through. And my sister-in-law, Galena, who's also part of our trauma care team, she often reminds me that when children know that you care, they don't care how much you know sometimes till they know how much you care, and that it really, really matters in the work that we do. Even if we feel like we're not meeting all the goals that we want to meet in education, if those children walk away knowing they were loved and cared for, then it was totally worth it.
Now I want to give you a chance to just share a little bit. So reflecting on these experiences, what are some of the most valuable insights that you have to create that caring environment where the caregivers feel cared for? Even if it's self-care, like what's your best advice for those that might be in similar roles that you are in?
Yeah, I think one thing that we talked about earlier was really listening and asking how people are doing, and then listening to what would be supportive to them. And it could be something small like bringing a meal when they've had a long day. And, I have friends who, to be able to eat around the table, I have a friend who she'll often invite me for dinner with her kids, and to be able to sit around the table with children that I'm not responsible for caring for, but just enjoying a family dinner, inviting someone into your home, or making sure there's time for a phone call. I have had friends that I can text and say, "I'm having a hard day," and know that they're going to be present. So just making sure that we're looking for ways that we can connect and support, even if someone's not asking for it, also asking ways that we can support.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our interview. Thanks so much, Amy Jo, for all your insights. And thank you for being a caregiver to some of our most vulnerable, because our children need caregivers like you.
Well, I appreciate it, Johan. And I will say that I get to work with caregivers every day. And I have witnessed so many in my life who are caring and caring well.
Thank you for joining another conversation on Journey with Care, where we inspire curious Canadians on their path of faith and living life with purpose in community. Journey with Care is an initiative of Care Impact, a Canadian charity dedicated to connecting and equipping the whole church to journey well in community. You can visit their website at careimpact.ca or visit journeywithcare.ca to get more information on weekly episodes, Journey with Prayer, and details about our upcoming events and meetups. You can also leave us a message, share your thoughts, and connect with like-minded individuals who are on their own journeys of faith and purpose. Thank you for sharing this podcast and helping these stories reach the community. Together we can explore ways to journey in a good way. And always remember to stay curious.